You have the floor.
Merci. Alors...
Thank you. I'm a literary translator, but I'm also a young language teacher. I teach German. And I just want to come back to the idea of language learning rather than translation as a tool for communication. In the 1970s, young teachers were required to use an overall structural approach. So we were forced to apply that approach, and fairly quickly that meant that we'd have particular slides with particular scenarios, and then you might hear somebody's voice saying something related to the slide, and the student was supposed to understand. The last thing you wanted to do was to use translation. Of course, the teacher gets a bit fed up and then starts whispering the answer, and it's not a great solution. And the reason I think that is because when you're teaching a language, I have to say I don't think you've touched on this enough. There are two phases in language learning. Firstly, passive understanding, and then the active stage where you're producing the language yourself. Often excellent translators speak their language very poorly. That's because they can understand everything, but they can't necessarily produce it themselves. So I just wanted to bring this to your attention. The overall structural method was based on this fundamental principle, and which is quite true, I think. The idea is that a child doesn't learn a language via translation, but rather they stick a word, attach it to a concept or a method, and that's the problem with the structural method, I think. What you're trying to do is to teach a student to stick a term to a concept or an object. Obviously, that takes time to sink in. You can start doing that in the initial phases. Once you're a teenager, you might then move on to translation. But as far as I'm concerned, I mean, I think translation is a really poor method of language teaching for all the reasons I've mentioned, because whenever the student goes via their own culture, their own language, because the point of learning a language is that you open yourself up to the culture, the gestures, the mindset of the other language. I think that's detrimental. So learning a language via translation means that you're supposed to acclimatize yourself to a new culture rather than attaching a concept or a vision of another world to the new word. That's the point I was trying to get across. I don't know what you make of it. If we take... apologies, Chair interrupts. Yes, well, let me just give you this final example from Benjamin. I mean, if you take Brot, for example, if you translate that with pain, that doesn't teach a student what German bread is. So there you have it. Apologies for being quite strident, but I'm really a proponent of the structural method, certainly when it comes to language learning. Well, quite. That's what makes such a panel discussion so interesting. If everybody shares your view, things would be a bit dull. I wonder if there's anybody else in the room who wishes to comment on the same subject or something else. Yes, sir?
I come from a monolingual country where the native language is a non-European language. And I'm an interpreter and translator, and for the past 40-odd years also I teach English in higher education in my country, Hungary. I do translation. I've been doing that for the duration of my entire teaching practice, usually at the request of my students, and usually they were satisfied with that, and with the disagreement of my colleagues, especially with the young generation. I find that translation promoted accuracy in L2 language competence, and also enhanced the conscious use of the language, which the age group is 18 to 24, 25, and they wanted to know consciously what they have been using. And this is where I think I would add one more value to the values that have been enumerated, the psychological value. The psychological value for the language learner, enhancing the self-confidence in using the language. We know, language teachers, that a lot of students are hesitant to speak until they are sure that what they are going to say will be 100% correct. So the translational system or method, or whatever we call approach, I think enhances this self-confidence that, okay, what I'm going to do, what I'm going to say will be correct because we have learned that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Some other comments or remarks? Yes, Madame?
I don't know if I'm the only Chinese here, probably, so I'd like to share my experience of learning English while translating. That's how we were taught in school. So in the classroom, yes, the translation took a large part of the classroom teaching and also in homework. When I think about it now, it comes very naturally. I didn't think I was translating. I was just given a task of expressing yourself in another language based on the text you are given. So yeah, that's my experience. So translation has been, or maybe still is, a very important part in the curriculum in the Chinese English teaching, at least. And another interesting thing is that now I teach in University of Vienna for Chinese translation between Chinese and English. And at the beginning of the class, I asked my students who are Austrians, who has been learning Chinese, why do you choose my class? And they said, we would like to learn and improve my Chinese. And I asked them, have you thought of being a translator later after you graduate? And they said no. So that's very interesting for me.
Okay, thank you very much. So would you like to answer?
Well, I think with all these interesting remarks, it's very difficult to strike up a coherent discussion. Well, we'll try to bring in a few ideas. So I think we have an inherent difficulty or problem here in our discussion, and that is that we are concerned with two not easy issues. The one is translation and the other is language learning. I mean, we could be sitting here and discussing language learning and teaching and what is involved in language learning. And the problem is that we focus on translation here and we kind of take for granted that we have some understanding or maybe some common understanding of language learning, which of course we don't have. One remark concerning language learning. I mean, we have to learn two things, right? I mean, we have to develop our knowledge, grammatical knowledge, lexical knowledge, as a means of expression, and we have to learn how to use our linguistic knowledge in communication. Now, the question is, how does this work? Do we first develop our knowledge and then try to apply it in communication and develop these skills? And the example you gave regarding words and their meanings, I think, falls under this notion of knowledge development. When you look at a little child, how they acquire language, they understand you before they have the words. And because of this, are they able to acquire the words, right? So because they are able to make sense of your utterances without knowing all the words, are they able to come up in an intuitive way with hypotheses regarding the meaning, concepts of these words? And I think, so in this sense, we acquire language not only for communication, but we acquire it through communication. And a lot of, in language acquisition research, takes a somewhat different approach, following Chomsky and these things, which I think is entirely wrong. So we need to look at language learning
and teaching from a communicative perspective. And this again then is where translation can come in, and we can see how it adds in this process.
Okay, Geneviève, few words. Quelques mots.
Je voulais réagir.
Oh yes, I just wanted to comment to what we heard from a couple of the speakers on this structural global audio-visual method. I mean, I won't wade into it here, we're amongst experts, but I think this debate could be boiled down to innovation. In the 70s, it was the new thing. It was an innovation because languages became accessible. There was mass language learning. You had to find some solution. Obviously, we drew on the Second World War. You had to teach the American army in particular, teach them in Northern Europe pretty quickly. And then they fed that back into mass education. But I think today's debate won't allow us to say that one method's good, the other is bad. I think the issue is one of belief. This is what I think. Nobody's going to shift me from my belief. That's not the idea necessarily, but we're not trying to convert you either to another faith. So what sort of innovations do we need in our new century to make sure that our Europeans are relevant in an ever more competitive world when they travel, for example? I mean, we always talk about mobility, and that's changed utterly the picture from one generation to the next. These are the kind of things we need to be discussing, I think, and we need to find answers, as honest answers as we can, drawing on the skills we have. So I'm happy to respond to the question. We heard that you're a Chinese language teacher. The question is whether students draw on translation in other aspects of learning, because the question is, how do you teach Chinese well? What does that constitute? Because I think that's at the core of my research. In the National Institute for Eastern Languages, obviously China and Chinese is a big player there. When you're trying to teach Chinese as a foreign language, how do you go about it? Would you try and do it in the way that Chinese learn their own mother tongue, or do you apply the European method? Do you try and fit it into the European framework with its frame of reference, drawing on the current Bible for language teachers? I think there's a debate that can be had either way. And I think you'd hear different answers in each of the three scenarios I outlined. That's my reaction in any case.
Beaucoup.